Your Bible calls him Peter, but that is not his name. That is a translation of a nickname that Jesus gave him in a language your Bible was not even written in. And inside that original word, buried in the Aramaic that Jesus actually spoke, is a promise so specific and so personal that it was not meant for Peter alone. It was meant for everyone who has ever been told, or has ever told themselves, that they are too broken to be trusted with something that matters. We are going to spend the next 40 or so minutes inside one name, one word that Jesus spoke on an ordinary afternoon by a lake to a man he had just met. And I want to show you that what Jesus said in that moment was not a compliment. It was not a nickname. It was a verdict, delivered before the evidence was in. But before we get there, I need to tell you something about a conversation on a beach after the resurrection. A conversation where Jesus asks the same question 3 times, but uses 2 completely different words, and almost nobody notices the switch. That switch is going to tell us everything about how restoration actually works. Hold that thought. Let us start at the beginning. John chapter 1, verse 42. Jesus has just met Simon for the first time. He looks at him and says, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas." That is it. No sermon. No explanation. Just a name, placed on a stranger like a stone being set into a foundation before anyone has poured the concrete around it. Now, if you are reading an English Bible, your translation almost certainly has a footnote here that says something like, "Cephas means Peter," which means rock, and you nod. And you move on, and you miss almost everything. So let us slow down. The word Cephas comes from the Aramaic Kepha. Kepha means rock, not a small rock, not a pebble, a solid mass of stone, the kind of thing you build a foundation on. This is important because Aramaic was the language Jesus actually spoke in daily conversation. Not Greek, not Hebrew, Aramaic. And in Aramaic, there is no ambiguity. When Jesus said, "You are Kepha, and on this Kepha I will build my church," he used the same word twice. The person and the foundation are linguistically identical. There is no gap between them. Now, when that statement got translated into Greek, something interesting happened. Greek has 2 words that are in the neighborhood of Kepha. There is Petra, which is a feminine noun referring to a massive rock formation, and there is Petros, which is a masculine noun, historically used for a smaller, movable stone. But here is the thing the scholars want you to know. By the 1st century, in the Greek Koine that the New Testament was written in, that distinction had largely collapsed. The 2 words were being used interchangeably. The reason the text uses Petros for Peter's name and Petra for the foundation is almost certainly a grammar issue, not a meaning issue. Petra is a feminine noun. You cannot name a man Petra. So the author uses Petros, the masculine form, for Peter's name, and retains Petra for the thing Jesus said he would build on. If Jesus had wanted to call Peter a small, insignificant pebble, he had a perfectly good word available, lithos. He did not use it. He used Kepha both times, in the original Aramaic, 1 word. Same word. The man and the mission, locked together in a single sound. Now, here is where it gets strange. The man's original name was Shimon, in Hebrew, Shimon. That name comes from the root word shama, which means to hear or to listen. Shimon, the one who hears. And if you know your Old Testament, you already feel something shift, because the 2nd son of Jacob was named Simeon, for the same reason. His mother Leah named him that because God had heard her suffering and given her a son. The name Shimon appears 44 times in the Old Testament, and most of those times it carries the shadow of a complicated inheritance. Because the tribe of Simeon, that 2nd son's descendants, did not have a good story. They were the tribe that participated in one of the most violent episodes in Genesis, the massacre of the men of Shechem. And when Jacob gave his final blessing over his sons in Genesis 49, Simeon was not blessed. Jacob said Simeon and Levi would be scattered. No land, no foundation. dispersed among the other tribes. Think about what the people in that room would have heard when Jesus looked at this man and said, "I am changing your name. You are no longer Shimon, the man without a foundation. You are Kepha. You are the rock." That is not a nickname. That is a reversal of a generational story. That is Jesus looking at a man whose tribal history was cursed to have no ground to stand on, and saying, "The ground starts here, with you." And then Peter goes and does everything in his power to prove Jesus wrong. If you are in your car right now, or folding laundry, or trying to fall asleep, I want you to stay with this part, because this is the part that is actually about you. Peter is given the name Rock at the very beginning of the story. And then, almost immediately, he starts behaving like anything but a rock. He is impulsive. He is loud. He cuts off a man's ear in the garden when Jesus is arrested, a reaction so dramatically inappropriate that Jesus has to stop and heal the wound on the spot. He declares with full confidence that he would die before he would deny Jesus. And then, a few hours later, standing in a courtyard, warming himself next to a fire, he does exactly what he swore he would never do. 3 times. 3 different people ask him if he knows Jesus, and 3 times he says no. The Greek of John 18 is exact about this. The people around the fire use the phrase, "Are you not one of his disciples?" And Peter says, "Uk eimi, I am not." Now, in the Gospel of John, that phrase, "ego eimi," I am, is one of the most theologically loaded phrases in the entire text. It is the phrase Jesus uses in John 8:58 when he says, "Before Abraham was, I am," directly invoking the divine name from Exodus. It is the phrase Jesus uses in the garden when the soldiers come to arrest him, and he says, "I am," and they fall backward. The "I am" is the signature of Jesus' divine identity throughout John's Gospel. And Peter, in the courtyard, says the exact opposite. "Uk eimi, I am not," the man named Rock, crumbling in the firelight. This is the moment we need to sit with for a second, because the way most of us have been taught to read this story, Peter's failure is a detour, a speed bump on the way to his restoration. But I think John intends us to feel the full weight of it. Peter did not just break a promise. He linguistically undid his own identity. The man who was supposed to be the foundation said, out loud, 3 times, "I am not what you think I am." And here's the thing the text is quietly insisting on, if you are willing to hear it. That is not the end of the story. Not even close. Let us jump forward. It is sometime after the resurrection. The disciples have heard reports that Jesus is alive. They have seen him once, in a locked room, but they do not quite know what to do with themselves. And Peter, in a very Peter move, says, "I am going fishing." And the others say, "Sure, we will come too." They fish all night. They catch nothing. By the standards of professional first-century fishermen on the Sea of Galilee, a night with an empty net was not a minor inconvenience. These men fished in the dark for a reason. Daytime made the nets visible to the fish. Night fishing with trammel nets, the kind used in that region, required coordination, timing, physical labor, a full night of effort, and nothing. By dawn they are exhausted, waterlogged, and coming home empty-handed. And then someone on the shore calls out and tells them to cast the net on the other side. And they do, and they cannot haul it in for the weight of the catch. And the disciple whom Jesus loved looks at the man on the shore and says to Peter, "It is the Lord." And Peter, still Peter, does the most Peter thing imaginable. He throws on his outer garment, because he had been working without it, and he jumps into the water and swims to shore, leaving the others to drag the net in by themselves. When he gets to the beach, there is a charcoal fire, bread, fish, already cooking. Now, if you know your Greek, you know that the word John uses for charcoal fire here is anthrakia. And you should know that anthrakia appears exactly twice in the entire New Testament. Once here, on the resurrection beach, and once in John 18, in the courtyard of the high priest, where Peter stood warming himself by a fire when he denied Jesus 3 times. John did not choose that word by accident. He is asking you to feel the echo. Peter is standing next to a charcoal fire for the second time in his life. The first time, he fell apart. Now, let us see what happens this time. Jesus gives them breakfast first, before the conversation, before the questions. Bread and fish, on the beach at dawn, after a long night. This is not a small detail. A man who wanted to prosecute Peter would not have started with breakfast. A man who wanted to shame Peter would not have said, "Come and eat." The first move Jesus makes is to sit down and share a meal. In the ancient Near East, table fellowship was not casual. Eating with someone was a covenant act. It communicated belonging, safety, shared life. Jesus is telling Peter, before a single word is spoken about what happened in that courtyard, you still belong at this table. And then the questions begin. Jesus turns to Peter and says, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Notice he calls him Simon here, not Peter, not Rock. Simon, the old name. This is not an accident. It is tender, and it is precise. Jesus is meeting Peter at the level of his failure. He is not pretending the man by the fire is already the man he is going to become. He is starting where Peter actually is. And the word Jesus uses for love in that first question is agapao, the word for the highest, most self-giving, most complete kind of love, the kind that does not depend on feeling, the kind that costs something. Peter answers with a different word. He says, "Lord, you know that I philo you." Philo is the word for warmth, affection, friendship. It is a real word for a real kind of love, but it is not agape. Peter, who once swore he would die for Jesus, cannot bring himself to claim the biggest word anymore. He has been humbled into honesty. He says the truest thing he can say. "I am fond of you. I care about you. I cannot say more than that right now." And Jesus says, "Feed my lambs." Second time, same question. "Agapas me? Do you love me?" Same answer, philo. And Jesus says, "Take care of my sheep." Third time. And here is the moment that the text asks you to pay careful attention to. This time, Jesus changes the word. He does not ask agapas me. He asks phileus me. Do you philo me? Does he drop to Peter's level? Is he meeting Peter where Peter actually is, rather than where Peter should be? John 21:17 says that Peter was grieved because Jesus asked him the third time. The word for grieved there in the Greek is lupeo. It means to be made sorrowful, to feel pain. The traditional reading is that Peter was grieved because Jesus asked 3 times, echoing the 3 denials. And that is almost certainly part of it. But consider the other layer. The first 2 times, Jesus asked for agape, and Peter offered philo. Peter was holding something back, a small corner of dignity, a small retreat from the full weight of what Jesus was asking. And then Jesus stepped into Peter's own word. And suddenly there is nowhere left to hide. There is no smaller offer Peter can make. There is no lesser version of love to retreat to. Jesus has followed him all the way down to the very bottom of his honest answer, and is asking, even this much, even just this, is it true? And Peter, stripped of every defense, says the most honest thing he has said in the entire gospel. He says, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Not I love you more than these. Not I would die for you. Just, you know. You already know. I cannot perform this for you. You see it or you do not." And Jesus says, "Feed my sheep." 3 denials, 3 reinstatements, 3 commissions. The covenant ceremony of the ancient Near East required a 3-fold confirmation to be binding. Jesus was not punishing Peter. He was performing a legal and spiritual act of restoration, using the exact number of repetitions that the culture understood as ratifying a new agreement. He was making it official, in front of witnesses, on a beach at dawn. Now, I want to give you 3 very specific things from this scene, because I think they are the actual protocol that Jesus used, and I think they work. First, before the conversation, there was breakfast. Before Jesus asked Peter anything, he fed him. The first move in Peter's restoration was not confrontation. It was care. If you are carrying a failure that you have not been able to move past, the first question is not what did you do and why. The first question is, have you let anyone sit with you in it? Have you let yourself be cared for before you have been cross-examined? Restoration does not begin with an audit. It begins with presence. Second, the question Jesus asked was not about the past. He did not say, "Why did you deny me?" He said, "Do you love me?" Present tense. The question is always about the relationship that exists right now, not about the record of what happened. If you have been rehearsing the worst version of yourself in your head for a long time, it might be worth asking whether you are answering the question Jesus is actually asking, or the question you have been asking yourself. Those are often very different questions. Third, the reinstatement was not a feeling. It was an action. Feed my lambs. Take care of my sheep. Jesus did not say, go and feel better about yourself. He gave Peter a task. He restored Peter's purpose, not just his standing. And there is something in that worth holding on to. The shame of a big failure tends to make us turn inward. The remedy, or at least part of it, seems to involve turning outward, finding someone who needs tending and tending to them, not because that earns anything, but because purpose and shame cannot fully occupy the same space at the same time. This week, one person. Find someone who needs to be seen or cared for, and do that specific thing for them, not as penance, as practice. Now here is what I keep coming back to when I sit with this whole story from beginning to end. Jesus knew Peter's name before Peter knew his own name. He looked at a man whose tribal history was cursed to have no foundation, whose personal history was about to include the worst night of his life, and he said, "You are the rock. Not you will become the rock if you perform well enough. Not you were the rock before you failed. You are." Present tense. Unconditional. The name Cephas was not given to Peter after he proved himself. It was given to him at the beginning, before the failures, before the denials, before the 3 times he stood by a fire and said, "I am not." And it was still his name on the other side of all of it. Because it was never a reward for good behavior. It was a description of what Jesus had already decided he was. And if the one who holds all things together can look at a man standing in the ruins of his own promises, warm himself next to the fire of his worst memory, and still call him by the name of what he is becoming, then the name being spoken over your life right now is not the name of your failure. It is the name of what he has already decided you are. That is what was buried in the word Cephas. Not just a name, a verdict delivered before the evidence was in. And the entire rest of Peter's story is just the evidence catching up to the verdict. There is one more detail in this story that we did not have time to get to today. The moment Peter sees the 153 fish in the net, John records that he jumped into the water fully clothed to swim to shore. In the ancient world, that number, 153, was not random. And what Peter did with his clothes before he jumped was not random either. The next video is going to take you into that number and what it meant to every fisherman and every rabbi who heard it. I will see you there.